that, it was a lot of work between a lot of different interviews done over the years. Because at the time the interviews were done, well, these cartoons were not available in home video. So we couldn't just watch the cartoons and ask questions. So we had to think of things as we thought of them. And so every interview we did was kind of jumping all around history. So I took 60 hours of taped interviews that included my questions and Mike's questions, as well as Bob Clampett's replies. And I edited that 60 hours down to 2.5 hours of just Bob Clampett talking about his life and career. So that is on the Beanie and Cecil DVD, Volume 1.
Yeah.
And there was an enormous amount of editing I had to do to rearrange everything so that I would have Bob Clampett's voice speaking of his life and career in a chronological order. Because none of the actual interviews originally were done that way.
Yeah.
So anyway, there is an example of something that I've done I think you might find quite enjoyable to listen to. But you may or may not want to rearrange, whatever we talk about. That's up to you. I don't mind.
Okay. Yeah, I'll figure it out as we go along, or as I go along the editing process and figure out how I want to go about it. You brought up Bob Clampett, and I was a child of the 90s, and so I grew up watching a lot of like the new stuff that was being put out there, like a lot of the Spumco cartoons, like Ren and Stimpy. But I also grew up I also grew up watching the classic cartoons on Cartoon Network, and they used to have director-specific shows for the classic MGM and Warner Brothers stuff. They had the Chuck Jones show, the Tex Avery show, and of course, the Bob Clampett show, which was incredible. I fondly remember those shows, especially Toonheads, because it was a Cartoon Network show called Toonheads that actually got me interested in the people who made these cartoons. There's still a lot I need to read up on in animation history. That book that Mike Barrier did, Hollywood Cartoons, I actually still need to get a copy of that sometime eventually.
That is the most in-depth and accurate history of Hollywood animation that you will ever find.
Oh, yeah.
So I really recommend that book. Mike Barrier poured 30 years of his life into interviewing people and organizing the information and finally writing the book.
It's awesome.
He'll answer most of your questions. Now, he stops before Michigan Krantz begins. That's a later era. He goes up to about the year 1960.
I mean, that was kind of the motivation for me getting in touch with you. I mean, Mike Barrier, he did write the definitive article on the making of Fritz the Cat, of course, which I looked through, skimmed through quite a bit of that article while before, in case there was something I missed that could have been interesting to talk about, but I had to put it down because at one point it's like, I'm just going to end up reading this whole thing again, and I don't have the time right now. Like I said, that's the definitive history of Fritz the Cat right there, but I think, I guess the main drive to document this history for me was that, this coming December, will be 10 years since Robert Taylor, the director of the second Fritz the Cat movie, passed away. And there was one interview done with him years ago, and the interviewer only asked him about questions regarding his work at Disney Television in the early 90s. And I thought, this guy had a career that was, I mean, no offense to the work he did for Disney television. I think the work he did before that was a lot more fascinating than that.
Well, see, Robert Taylor grew up in New York, and he was friends with Ralph Bakshi when they were both kids in New York.
Huh.
Or at least teenagers.
Yeah.
And then Robert Taylor came to Hollywood several years before Ralph Bakshi, and that's when Robert Taylor and I met. And Robert Taylor from time to time would tell me about this crazy guy that he used to know in New York named Ralph Bakshi. And he sounded like a wild man. Then years later when I met Ralph Bakshi, he lived up to the hype. This man was completely insane.
Wow. That's incredible.
But I loved him because unlike the other people I met, like all the great animators of the Disney studio, there was no passion. Maybe it was bottled up inside of them and they put it all into their work. But to talk to them, there was no interest in talking about cartoons at all, even ones they worked on. So for me to meet a live wire like Ralph Bakshi, it was like, finally a soulmate.
That's
somebody
incredible.
I can relate to.
Yeah, that was one of the questions. I was actually really glad to read the email you sent me with the answer to that question. Just starting with, and you actually answered another question I had was if you were familiar with Robert Crumb's work before the Fritz the Cat movie production was announced.
Yeah, I saw. Are you familiar with the comic books that were printed? They were not comic book size. They were larger size, and they were sold in not with magazines. They were sold in odd places like drugstores as a novelty item.
Yeah.
And so it was just chance that I happened to see those. And I thought, what is this? This looks like a comic book.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is off the subject, but that was the first time that I saw Robert Crumb's name on the Fritz the Cat comic book. About 10 years earlier, maybe a little longer, there were some greeting cards that he did very early in his life.
Yeah.
And they were really funny. They had these funny characters, the way Robert Crumb draws them. And I bought a couple of them and saved them because I thought, wow, these are great. And since then, they've been kind of misplaced in one of many boxes, so I wouldn't be able to just put my hands on it right away. But, boy, I recognize the genius of Robert Crumb way back, the very first drawing of his I ever saw.
Oh, yeah.
And these are called high-top greeting cards.
Yeah.
Do you remember? Have you seen any of those?
I have seen, I picked up, Fantagraphics put out like the complete Crumb books, and through different kinds of Crumb books, that's how I've seen his greeting cards. And yeah, I agree. Those greeting cards he did for American Greetings were really great. They weren't as wild and crazy as his later work, but there's still like this spark there that I think makes them a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, of course, I read all the Fritz the Cat comics that had a very short run as far as comics went. And it's funny that Fritz is pretty close to iconic character, but definitely a cult icon character for such a short, not just a short run of comics, but also a very short run of movies.
Yeah.
the Mr. Natural comics that Crumb did, those are excellent. I love those a lot too.
Yeah.
Let's see. Starting off with, I'll do a question with each film chronologically. But yeah, that email you answered was excellent. I guess the first question I have about Fritz the Cat, which you had answered, and I hope you don't mind going over again. When the film was announced, like, was there like anticipation with amongst animators when it was announced that this movie was gonna, production on it was gonna start sometime soon?
No, I didn't hear a thing. Nobody had any interest. And the animators in those days were mostly older guys from the earlier eras. There wasn't much room for new people to get into the business. So I was one of just a handful of people that were of a new generation.
Right.
But among the old guys, they were kind of, it was almost like a religion with them. They were indoctrinated with the thought of, wait a minute, X-rated? We don't do that. And low budget? Well, that's probably going to be just junk. So we don't want to be involved in that. And that was the general tone, to the extent there was any discussion at all. And discussion only happened when I brought up the subject.
Right.
Because otherwise they weren't even talking about it. And I'm going around, oh, wow, you know, this guy in New York is going to come out here with this underground comic book, you know, for a movie, Fritz the Cat.
Yeah.
And they just looked at me like, well, what kind of a pervert are you? You even want to work on something like that?
Yeah, there's a great quote in that old Mike Barrier article about Fritz the Cat, the one from, there's a nameless executive at Hanna-Barbera who said, quote, "It's unfortunate that this industry has to resort to this kind of picture making to survive. I hope I never have to be a part of it."
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that sums it up very well, the attitude of the vast majority of animators in the business at that time.
Right. At the same time, though, there's a lot of talk about, like, I guess there were people who were excited because there was this idea that Fritz the Cat was really there had to have been somebody excited because this was like brand new territory for an animated feature film of all things to enter.
Yeah.
And Walt Disney had
this was considered a radical departure.
Oh yeah, and Walt Disney had been passed away quite a while ago, and so it seemed like animated features were going to go in a new direction at that point.
Well, animation features almost didn't survive at all.
Yeah.
Even the Disney studio wasn't sure if they were going to continue making cartoon features. They were really thinking of shutting the place down.
Oh, man.
And so the first feature we worked on after Walt died, which was the Aristocats, there was talk that was going to be the last one.
Wow.
Because that one was in storyboard when Walt was still alive. And I don't know how much attention he was paying to it. Oh, there was some storyboarding going on. I'm trying to remember what it was. If it was while Walt was still alive, some early exploratory work on Robin Hood.
Okay.
And I would go up to Ken Anderson's office at lunchtime when he'd be out to lunch and look at these storyboards on these new features coming up and think, oh, wow, okay. But then I was in a room just next to the room when Wooly Reitherman and his main people were going through those storyboards and talking about taking everything out that had any guts. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm never going to want to work on this. And I wasn't supposed to be there, but I was. I was deliberately eavesdropping. And I'm hearing all this talk. I'm thinking, oh my gosh. So, we were just starting work on Robin Hood, and that's when I quit Disney's and went over and joined Ralph Bakshi. I never regretted that decision.
Oh, that's great. What was the timeline here? Did animation on Fritz the Cat, did that start around 1970 or 71?
No, in 71, we were working on it in Hollywood. Now, my understanding is that Ralph Bakshi somehow got some interest from Warner's, put some money into a proposal for a feature-length cartoon. This was for Fritz the Cat.
Right.
And so this would be around 68 or 69 in there somewhere. Let's say 69. That probably was when. And so Ralph and the animators that he had in New York, they worked for some time on a 20-minute segment from the feature.
Right.
And that was the whole section about Fritz in Harlem. So Ralph gets that done, takes it to Warner's, and says, okay, here's 20 minutes of the feature we got done. And Warner's, they were horrified to see cartoons with Negro characters. And so they just said absolutely no way. They just shut the thing down.
Right.
And so the story that Ralph tells is that he and Steve Krantz were together on this trip. And so they had both experienced the outrage of the executives at Warner's. And so on the plane back to New York, well, Steve Krantz is really angry at Ralph. Why in the world did you pick a section with all Negro characters? You know, that's what got us shut down. Maybe we would have had a chance if you had done something different. And so they get back to New York, and they get back to their own office building, which is part of a floor in a high-rise building. They're going up the elevator, and Krantz supposedly is still harping at Ralph. You idiot, you stupid. You know, you made this cartoon with black characters. But there's a guy on an elevator with them who had an office on another floor in the same building.
Right.
And this was a guy who was making live-action movies with black actors. They were called black exploitation movies.
Right.
And he was making a living off of that. He heard these two guys arguing, and he says, wait a minute, I'd like to see what you've got, because I'm making these kind of movies. So he put up some money so they could continue animating the film, finishing the film. So it was at that point that Ralph and Steve decided, well, we just don't have enough animators in New York to do this. We have to move to Los Angeles. And that's pretty much the way it was told to me by Ralph. Now, Ralph is a storyteller.
Yes.
So anything Ralph says, you got to take with a grain of salt. That's the way he tells it.
He's a compelling storyteller. I've pretty much read every interview with him. Yeah, you mentioned in the email, too, that there were no pencil tests on Bakshi's films, and there were no pencil tests on the second Fritz movie, too, huh?
Yeah, no pencil tests on either movie. And that continued even when Ralph had his own studio. And it was, for me, because I was kind of a beginner animator, really. I didn't have years of experience working on theatricals with pencil tests. So I felt I was flying in the dark and trying to learn how to animate, but you need pencil tests to know if what you're doing is working. Even the Disney animators needed pencil tests.
Right.
So yeah, it was very difficult.
Oh yeah, I love that. They got a quote in that article by Norman McCabe. He was talking about the lack of complete storyboards on Fritz the Cat, and when he asked Ralph where the complete boards were, Ralph's reply was, "In my head."
Yeah.
On the subject of Norman McCabe, along with you, there's so many Golden Age people who worked in the Golden Age of animation credited on here. There's, of course, Norm McCabe. There's John Gentilella, who was, I believe, with Fleischer and Famous.
Yeah, he was from New York.
Yeah.
John Genitalia.
And
I don't think he came out to Los Angeles. I think he was, Ralph was mailing scenes to about 3 animators in New York. Yeah. They did working in New York because that's where they lived.
Right. Like James Tyre is another New York City animator that's credited on this one.
You're right. And I never met him. He stayed in New York.
Yeah. Virgil Ross, was he a Warner Brothers guy too from the old days?
Oh, he sure was. I got Virgil in there because Ralph was asking me, "Bill, do you know any animators we can get? Especially good ones."
Yeah.
And so I mentioned a few, and Virgil Ross was one of them. And Virgil Ross was kind of retired or semi-retired at that point.
Yeah.
But Ralph called him, and Virgil said, "Well, if you don't mind me having a big chair at my animation desk, and after lunch I take a nap for an hour, I'll give you your 8 hours a day, but you have to expect that as an old man, I'm going to get sleepy after lunch, and so if you will allow me to sleep in my chair for an hour before I get back to work, well then, fine." So Ralph said, "Sure, okay. And so that was the arrangement. And Virgil Ross worked on, I don't remember if he worked on Fritz. I know he worked on Heavy Traffic. I don't remember if he worked on Fritz or not.
He's credited on Fritz. Yeah, I have the animator credits in front of me just to jog my memory of who worked on what.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good then.
Yeah.
So I guess he did work on Fritz for a while.
Yeah, another, I think this is another New Yorker, Nicholas Tafuri. I think maybe he was a Fleischer guy too.
Probably, yeah. But he was definitely New York. I never met him. He was one of the guys that Ralph would have been mailing work to. And then they would mail their animation back.
Yeah, there's like so many. Did you know Richard Lundy? Dick Lundy, I guess he's known as?
Dick Lundy? Oh yeah, I know him. I mean, until he died, but real nice guy. I love his work.
Yeah, he worked at Disney at one point in the past, right?
He sure did. He was an animator back in the early days. And then around the early to mid 1930s, Walt Disney made him a director on the Donald Duck cartoons.
Yeah, there's a scene in Fritz the Cat where I think it's before the bombing of the ghetto. You see a cameo by certain Disney characters waving flags, cheering them on. So the idea that an old Disney man worked on this film is pretty outrageous in a way.
Yeah. Now, Dick Lundy, I don't know if you're interested or not. He left the Disney studio at the time of the strike in 1941, and he went over to the Walter Lantz studio. So Dick Lundy and another Disney guy named Seamus Cohane Well, through the 40s, they directed the Walter Lantz cartoons.
Oh.
Made some really good ones.
Wow.
Walter Lantz has a real bad reputation just for making 48 on. His cartoons are just awful. But during most of the 1940s, there were some really good Lantz cartoons. And they were almost all of them directed by Seamus Culhane and Dick Lundy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I read Seamus Culhane's memoir just last year, I think, was when I finished it. Talking Animals and Other People. Yeah, that was a really good book. Cosmo Ancelotti, that's a name I've seen credited on quite a bit of stuff. He's mentioned in Ralph's coffee table book, and I remember I saw his name in a book by John Canemaker as well about the making of the Raggedy Ann and Andy movie in the late 70s.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's credited on some of Ralph's early cartoons too that he did at Paramount, like Marvin Diggs and stuff like that.
Yeah, I never met him because he stayed in New York. He would be one of the guys that Ralph would have mailed work to.
Ah, yeah. There's also a Joe Gray credited with assistants animators. No relation?
No relation at all. I never met him. Again, he was in New York.
What about, there's another guy here who's credited too. He's credited on quite a bit of Bakshi's films too, named Jack Foster.
Yeah, that name I don't know.
Jack Foster. I'm trying to remember where I've seen Arthur Vitillo. I know I've seen Art Vitillo and quite credited on quite a few things.
Now, I can tell you some stories about Art Vitillo. He grew up in halfway between L.A. and San Diego in a little town called what was it called? I want to say Ocean Beach or something like that. It'll come back to me. He was a senior in high school and for whatever reason decided to drive up to Los Angeles and go to Ralph's studio and see if he could break into animation. And Ralph was impressed by his eagerness.
Yeah.
So he gave him little bits of animation to do. So Art Vitillo was a young guy, quite a bit younger than me, but he was working for Ralph while he was still in high school.
Yeah, wow. That's incredible. There was, we talked a little bit about Steve Krantz as well. As far as you mentioned that you never really saw much of Steve Krantz and he wasn't around the animators much.
Yeah, he stayed in his office. I have no idea what he was doing there. Once in a while we'd see him in the hallway. So I knew what he looked like, and he seemed like a pleasant guy. But that's all I know. I had no other interaction with him at all.
Yeah, and he was the owner of the animation studio that these 3 movies were being produced at, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the Fritz the Cat movies along with Heavy Traffic. And I asked you if you, like, how would you describe, like, the building? It was not a bad building. It was pretty average.
Yeah, nothing odd about it. Just a typical office building that you'd find anywhere. And it was a tall building, and it was several stories tall. There might have been a story or two above us. We were on either the 4th or 5th floor. I don't remember.
There was the reason I asked you about that was because I read later articles when after Ralph and Steve Krantz had their departure from each other, Ralph got a new building to start Bakshi Productions on, and it was described as shabby in an article, and it was funny because there was a documentary made on Ren and Stimpy, and Vincent Waller, he described Spumco as, pardon my language, he described the building that Spumco was in as a, quote, shithole, and it got me wondering, maybe maybe the most fascinating things in animation are produced in buildings that are probably decrepit.
Well, certainly the Warner Cartoon Studio had a reputation. They called themselves Termite Terrace.
Right.
And it was borderline shabby. It was certainly the one building that was called Termite Terrace, and then the name just stuck even after they moved out of that building. That was probably a pretty rickety old building that was about ready to fall apart. I've seen the other buildings, and they were just average. The main studio that was the Warner Cartoon Studio in the 1940s, Bob Clampett gave me a tour of that building one time.
Yeah.
We walked through it even though it was no longer the Warner Cartoon Studio. And people that were working there, they were yelling at us, "Get out of my office." But that didn't stop Bob Clampett. He just said, and this is the room where Carl Stalling used to have his piano, and he would compose his music in here.
Oh, wow, that's incredible.
So, I've actually seen a bunch of these places. See, I was involved in interviewing people for Mike Barrier's book. Well, that opened up a few doors for me. People were willing to show me things. So I got to see a lot of things that otherwise I would not have seen. And as far as calling Bakshi's building on Melrose shabby, not especially. Now, of course, my frame of reference is Termite Terrace.
Right. Right. The original shabby building where amazing cartoons were created.
Oh, yeah. And those cartoons were made on very low budgets. Most of the cartoon studios had much better budgets than the Warner cartoons.
Right.
The only other cartoons that were comparable to the Warner cartoons for budget were Walter Lantz. But every other studio had much higher budgets. MGM and Disney and Fleischers had much higher budgets.
Yeah, it's really interesting, like, looking back on the history of, like, particularly Fritz the Cat and stuff. There was, do you remember a magazine called National Lampoon?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, before the Fritz the Cat movie was released, they did a parody of Fritz the Cat called Fritz the Star, and it was kind of their jab at R. Crumb, and the Fritz the Cat character as having, like, sold out. It was a very odd parody, but it was memorable because it was part of that, just the reaction that there was a Fritz the Cat movie being made.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing that article. I bought a bunch of those magazines, but I didn't have time to look through them very much because I was really working pretty long hours, especially since I was a beginner animator and no pencil test. Well, I would put in a lot of extra hours for no extra pay, and I didn't mind because I figured, well, this is the price I'm paying. Ralph is giving me an opportunity that I probably don't even deserve. And I don't want to let him down, so I want to really try to do good work here.
Yeah, it's an interesting parody. It was done by a cartoonist named Randall Enos, and he actually replicates Robert Crumb's style pretty, at least his early art, pretty on the nose. So it was interesting. Once Fritz the Cat was released and it made, like, a lot of money, which I don't know if that was a surprise to people or not. Was the reception of, like, Ralph's oncoming projects and everything, was it different then? Were people still kind of nervous about this idea of adult cartoons?
Yeah, there was still a pretty good degree of nervousness about that. And there were accusations of pornography.
Oh.
And Ralph himself said, I have no interest in pornography. I'm doing X-rated material because characters I acknowledge are having sex, but we never show it the way it would be in a pornographic movie.
Right.
Okay. I was surprised to hear him make that statement, but he did. He said, I'm not interested in pornographic movies, but X-rated because they are adult themes. He says, yeah, that's what I'm doing.
It seemed like there was kind of this expectation for Fritz the Cat to be a novelty. Like, I don't think anybody expected it to be like any kind of serious artistic statement as a film.
Well, the film was drawn very crudely in many respects, animated very crudely in many respects, and yet at the same time there was a lot of innovation going on. And I was then and still am very impressed by the innovations that Ralph would come up with to add spice and visual interest to the movie.
Right. There's a scene, I don't know how long it's been since you've seen the film, but yeah, I think it was a couple days ago. Ralph posted a scene from Fritz the Cat on his Twitter account. It was this scene where Duke the crow gets shot, and that was, I always think about that scene in particular from Fritz the Cat because that was, you know, the movie starts off as kind of this freewheeling, a bit rowdy, a bit raunchy kind of adventure, and then once the death of Duke happens in the film, the tone changes, like shifts quickly, and it goes more into like the kind of territory that, say, a movie like Easy Rider covered.
Well, the entire section of the movie that takes place in Harlem was done entirely in New York.
Right.
With money that they got from Warner's. And so there were no Hollywood animators on that. I like the New York animators work better in the movie. The Hollywood animators were too correct, too straight, too literal. Whereas the New York animators had a lot more freewheeling feeling to their work. And I really liked that. Because to me it fit the tone of the story.
Yeah, that's I think I know which one you're talking. Yeah, the Harlem scene is definitely noticeably, it has more kind of a loose feeling to the artwork and the animation and stuff, and it's noticeably different from the rest of the film, now that you mention it. It's the Cat, for a brief period there was kind of I guess a fad with adult cartoons once Fritz the Cat was released. That Mike Barrier article mentioned a pornographic short film that was plagiarized, not adapted, from Harvey Kurtzman's Little Annie Fanny. I've actually seen that short, and it is noticeably crude.
I don't think I've seen it. I don't think I've seen that.
It's a pretty ridiculous kind of thing. It's basically, it not only does it liberally use Little Annie Fanny, it liberally uses other comic strip characters like Dagwood, Bumsteed, and Charlie Brown, and Dick Tracy, I think. So it's what you would expect. There was another film they mentioned in there too. It's actually an anime called Cleopatra, released as Cleopatra, Queen of Sex. Are you familiar with Osamu Tezuka by any chance?
Well, I know the name and I'm not a fan, so I tend not to pay much attention to what he does. I've seen a few things. I have some friends that are really into this Japanese animation. Oh, you gotta see this. Oh, you gotta see that. And I look at it and I go, I'm so bored.
Me personally, Japanese animation was something I really got into, especially since a lot of it was being imported when I was a kid. So I got like the best. I got the best animation of both the East and the West growing up there.
Now, not to change the subject, but I think it was after Fritz the Cat was released that somebody else decided to do an adult cartoon, and it was not too bad. It was called Dirty Duck.
It's actually I've seen it, yeah, and you're credited on Did you with on A Mouse and a Child? I think which
that's a whole different movie.
Yeah, but the co-director of The Mouse and His Child was Charles Swenson, who directed Dirty Duck.
Oh yeah. No, I just picked up some work because I was between jobs at the time, and work was being handed out from a studio called Mary Copping Wolf, and that's when I did some scenes in the cartoon called A Mouse and His Child.
Right.
Working in the studio where I really knew what the movie was about. I just had these random scenes.
But yeah, Dirty Duck that's a really funny movie. Kind of I don't know how to describe it. Kind of stonerish humor, but still very enjoyable.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the vehicle for a few musicians, Howard Kalin and Mark Volman, who of course were working with Frank Zappa a little bit before then, I believe. You're familiar with Zappa?
I'm not familiar with his music, but I'm certainly familiar with him. He makes a lot of political statements. I usually completely agree with him.
Oh, right.
So I have this very fond regard when I think of Frank Zappa. But I gotta tell you that, whatever it's worth, I grew up in the 1950s, and I developed a real liking for 1950s rock and roll, which is now not called rock and roll, it's called bebop.
Right.
And because rock and roll changed. But it was very personal, guys working in their garages, coming up with music that was personal. And there's a lot of very funny music by black performers like the Coasters and the Drifters and so forth. And I love that stuff. But finally, about 1964, a bunch of things started happening, political movements, that caused the funny rock and roll to not be played on the air anymore. And it started getting political and manufactured by big companies. So about the time of Bob Dylan and the Beatles and the group they called themselves the Archies, I just got so fed up with that stuff because to me it wasn't funny. And so I turned the radio off. I remember clearly it was summer of 1964. I said, I've had it. I turned the radio off and never went back. So all the music that came after that, most of it I never heard. Now I'd hear odds and ends, some things I liked at friends' houses, and little groups like the Mamas and the Babas, and certain odd things that I did like. But those were the exceptions. I regarded those as the exceptions. Whenever I did try to give a listen a little bit, it was this real manufactured stuff that to me had no personal soul. It was like created by a machine. So that separated me from what you might be more familiar with.
Okay. Yeah, I grew up quite a bit. I grew up listening to a lot of rock music from the 50s as well. I mean, I have, my mom's older sister and stuff would listen to a lot of it. The obvious stuff like Elvis, of course, but then there were also like a lot of the others, a lot of the other smaller songs and stuff that came out from that same era. I grew up listening with an appreciation for Chuck Berry and other musicians like that too.
Oh yeah.
Which actually there's a really great sequence in Heavy Traffic set to a Chuck Berry song done by, I think it was Mark Kausler.
Yeah. Well, Mark Kausler.
Any final words you would say on the first Fritz the Cat movie?
I don't know. It's hard for me to guess what I am familiar with that you might not be, because it just seems so obvious to me, especially with Mike Barrier's articles and stuff, that it's pretty much common knowledge, all the stuff surrounding the first Fritz the Cat. I would have to rely on your questions.
For the moment, that was really, I think you answered quite a... Oh, actually, on the subject of... I guess I did ask you, too, at one point about the, like, kind of artistic freedom you had working on Fritz the Cat. Like, it wasn't... This wasn't just, like, a regular job, was it? Was there, like, any kind of, like... I think we already covered the whole thing about artistic passion.
Well, see, I followed my instructions, and I don't think any of the animators felt they had artistic freedom. We were following the instructions that we got. Ralph Bakshi would, as he said, have the storyboard in his head, and he wanted to keep it that way so that he could be more flexible and change things as he went along. So when he was ready to put a scene into animation, he would scribble out some character layouts, very loose, and then hand them to a couple of guys. The main guy was John Sperry,
right?
Who would take Ralph's scribbles, and he would do very detailed character layouts. And so, getting that information in the form of character layouts from John Sperry, and Ralph would work out an exposure sheet, although mostly the characters speaking and the dialogue written out on the exposure sheets. That was most of what we got on the exposure sheets. It wasn't much else. Because the characters are just walking and talking most of the time. There wasn't anything unusual. Like in a Warner cartoon, wild, crazy things happen. And so you'd need exposure sheets to say, well, this action starts here and this gesture here. But in Fritz the Cat and Heavy Traffic, things were so straight, just people walking and talking, that you didn't need special instructions. And so you followed what you thought they wanted, and in that sense of the word, there was no artistic freedom. We were not encouraged to innovate anything.
So, here was another question I meant to ask before we go into some questions I have about Heavy Traffic. Having Fritz the Cat on your resume as you went from job to job, was there ever a point where anybody looked at that and thought, like kind of a...
Well, that happened a couple of times, and for the most part, I didn't even have to show a resume. The mere fact that I didn't go back to Disney's, so I was working in television animation. I worked in Hanna-Barbera, Caddy Freeling, and Filmation. And all they cared about is, are you experienced? If you are, well, come on in. We need bodies to fill desks to grind out this crap that we're doing for television. And so that was it. So no one, for the most part, gave a thought to, well, what did you work on? I would mention both Disney's and Bakshi and Hanna-Barbera as the places I worked at the most. See, Bakshi wouldn't always go from one feature to the next, because there was time when he was developing the next feature. So there was time that we were all laid off for, half a year.
Wow.
So we would have to go get work somewhere else, and we did. We'd either go to Hanna-Barbera, they would hire anybody to hold a pencil and draw that crap. And let's see, I worked over at Chuck Jones' studio. I worked there as an assistant animator under Manny Perez. And so I worked there for a while. Then I went back to animating again for Ralph Bakshi. There was a layoff period between Fritz and Heavy Traffic. We didn't just go right from one into the other, because Ralph had to develop. He had to make up a story, and so that took time.
Trying to do as much research as I could on Heavy Traffic a while ago, and it was interesting reading about how it developed, because there were ideas thrown around like it was going to be an anthology movie. Steve Krantz described it as being like a rock fantasia, and apparently they were even throwing around the ideas of courting Robert Crumb again for like an adaptation of Head Comics, or using the Mr. Natural character for a film, until Heavy Traffic. Yeah, and then the rock fantasia thing came a little bit afterwards, and then eventually it just developed before it developed into what Heavy Traffic is, which was Ralph's more kind of very personal, more autobiographical film.
See, that would have probably happened between Steve Krantz and Ralph Bakshi, while the rest of us were gone working at other studios.
Right.
So whatever arguments they might have had, or things they explored, I would have no way of knowing. All I know is that when Ralph was ready to start animation on Heavy Traffic, the story was pretty worked out in his mind at that point. And he had characters designed, probably using John Sperry.
Yeah.
And we just started right in animating.
There was something I wanted to ask you about, too, because there was a point where on Heavy Traffic, Ralph and Steve Krantz, they had a bit of a falling out, and Ralph was actually off the movie for a little bit, and Gerard Baldwin took over as a director for a little bit, and I was wondering, was any footage completed with Gerard Baldwin as director?
I don't know. I was there when it happened, but Gerard Baldwin was only there about a week or two at the most. I'm remembering about a week, but I could be off. It might have been 2 weeks.
Right.
But Ralph probably threw out anything that Gerard Baldwin did, because Gerard Baldwin had no imagination and was just fumbling around. What happened was there was such a big falling out between Ralph and Steve Krantz that they probably got into a fist fight or something. So all of us showed up for work the next day, get off the elevator, and there, at the door where you go through to enter into the animation studio, there was a guy sitting in a chair, a middle-aged guy, looked like a sheriff out of, old Western movies, and with a big shotgun across his lap. And all of us are looking at this guy like, what the hell is this? And are we supposed to go in the door or not? He didn't act like he was trying to keep us out, so rather timidly, we went past him through the door. We found out later that he was there for the express purpose of keeping Ralph Bakshi out of the studio. So a little bit later that same morning, we were all called into a group meeting, and Steve Krantz came and addressed us, and he said, Ralph is no longer on the picture. He didn't say why. And he said, you'll have a new director pretty soon. So in the meantime, just keep working on the scenes you have. And if you have any questions, don't ask me, because I don't know. Wait until the new director comes in and you can save your questions for him. So I already had a couple scenes that Ralph had given me, so I just kept working on those. And I guess most of the other animators are pretty much the same thing. And then finally, after a week or two, Gerard Baldwin was not there anymore. I actually had no interaction with Gerard Baldwin, because I had scenes that Ralph had given me that I was still working on. So whatever Gerardman did, I don't even know. And then the next thing we knew, well, Gerard Baldwin was out and Ralph was back. So I guess Ralph and Steve patched things up, came to some kind of an agreement, and Ralph finished the picture. It took a few more months. Ralph finished the picture, and then Ralph left, and there was that gap in between when we go work for other studios until Ralph was ready to hire us at his studio. And virtually all of us that were working for Ralph on Heavy Traffic went with him on his next feature. And so Steve Krantz, in the meantime, evidently had to find a writer to write some kind of a story for what they eventually called 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat. And it was a terrible story. And if you've seen the movie, well, you know what I mean.
Yes, I know what you mean.
So then Steve had to start hiring new people. And somehow he got Bob Taylor away from Ralph Bakshi. I don't know anything about how that happened, because Bob Taylor was working with Ralph Bakshi. And so we got Bob Taylor away as director. And then that was about the time that I left Ralph. And because they were hiring animators on Fritz. So I went over there and continued animating on Fritz. I say continued, meaning the same character. And so otherwise they had all new people. I think Art Vitale at some point came over and joined us. I think he was there. But there was a bunch of new people. One guy of some interest was a guy named John, let's see, check my notes here. Yeah, John Bruno.
Oh, yeah.
John Bruno, I think. Oh, you know who he is?
Oh, no, but I see his name. I have the animator credits pulled up, and I see his name on it.
Yeah, I think he was fairly new to the cartoon business then, and this may have been his first time working in a studio. He may have worked at a couple other places for a short time, I don't know. But this is when I met him. And I mentioned him because he was quite a character, kind of like Ralph Bakshi, flamboyant. And he did not stay in the animation business very long. After maybe a couple years, well, he branched out into something he was more interested in, which was doing special effects for live-action movies. And later I saw the movie Ghostbusters, the first one. And I thought, wow, some of these characters sure remind me of the way that John Bruno drew characters. And then in the screen credits, there was his name, John Bruno. And I thought, oh, okay.
That's amazing.
John Bruno stayed in special effects from that time on. So I've only seen him a couple of times since then, like at comic book conventions, things like that.
One last thing about Heavy Traffic before we go more into the 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat. I thought was kind of interesting was a guy named George DiCaprio was apparently working at the offices at the time. And he was a comic book author, and I guess a comic book distributor. And, well, he has a son who is an actor, of course. I don't think I need to mention who his son is.
I became very close friends with George DiCaprio. And we did a lot of things together. This was before Leonardo was born. So one of the things that happened was that with my eager enthusiasm for the old theatrical cartoons from the 40s, I slowly started to put together a collection. This was still before home video. And I started to slowly put together a collection of 16mm prints of these classic cartoons from the 40s. and some Disney features, a bunch of Warner cartoons, Lance. And I had a movie projector, and I would show these cartoons to whoever might be interested in seeing them. Because I was trying to make people aware that there were some really great cartoons made in the past. Because young people were unfamiliar with them. Because they were not being shown on TV at all at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so a friend of mine who had a house down near the Hollywood Bowl, his name was Bob Conico. Well, he was working just on the fringes of the business. And he made his house available. Let's do a screening every Friday night of these cartoons that you've got. And so myself and another guy who's a film collector, big time, much bigger than me, Mark Kosler. Myself and Mark Kosler, we would bring our movie projectors and a bunch of cartoons, and we would show them. Well, George DiCaprio loved seeing these cartoons, and he was connected with the underground comic movement. So he arranged for all of the guys in the Los Angeles area that were involved with underground comic books to come to our screening. He invited them. So that made up most of our audience. So every Friday night for 3 years, we did these screenings. And during that time, well, as we could find prints floating around somewhere, well, Mark Kosler and myself, we bought more and more prints. So we were able to widen the range of what we were showing, kind of keep our program fresh. And so we had about 20 people every week for 3 years coming to our screenings, and they were all of the underground comic book artists. I'd have to stop and think of the names: Bill Stout and Dave Stevens and John Pound and Bob Foster, and I'm bad on names, so I know I'm forgetting a bunch of people. But sometimes when underground comic book artists would come down from the San Francisco area for some reason, well, George would make sure that they knew about our screenings, and they would show up at our screenings. So we had a bunch of extra visitors from time to time. So yeah, until Leonardo was born, well, I was very close friends with George DiCaprio.
That's excellent.
But by the time that Leonardo was born, well, George DiCaprio, well, our screenings had ended. There's a bunch of reasons for that. We finally came to an end. And then George got involved in different things. And so our paths didn't cross as often as before. We kind of lost touch. Okay. And I remember that when Leonardo was a baby and all the way up to about the age of 6, well, George was saying to me, oh, my kid's going to be a movie star. I'm thinking, yeah, sure, yeah, that's everybody's dream. But then, several years later, I open up the newspaper and here's a double-page ad for some movie called The Titanic, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. My jaw dropped. I thought, my God, he really did it. And since then, I've become a real fan. I haven't seen George DiCaprio since, not in person. Leonardo. I haven't seen him since. I've seen his dad a couple times, but not Leonardo. Yeah. But I have really become a fan of Leonardo's work, because he's a really good actor. He has a lot of charisma. So whenever he's in a movie, I make a point to go see it. Just because, not because I maybe knew him as a baby, but just because I genuinely, there's certain actors whose work I really like, and he's one of them.
Yeah, there's a few Martin Scorsese films that he's in that I think are pretty good, like Gangs of New York and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So on to a little bit more about the 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat. You mentioned the story was bad. The funny thing about the 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat is that there's 3 credited writers on that movie.
Oh, there are. I didn't notice.
Yeah, Bob Taylor is one of the writers, and there's 2 other writers. One of them is was a young black man named Eric Monte, who created TV shows like Good Times and What's Happening. He's credited on that film, and Steve Krantz would later produce a movie from one of his screenplays called Cooley High later on. The other writer who's credited is a guy named Fred Halliday, who I've seen credited on the Spider-Man show that Krantz and Bakshi produced in the 60s. I was curious, did you know Fred Halliday at all, or no?
No, not at all. When I went to work on 9 Lives of Fritz, I didn't see a storyboard, I didn't see anything, and I was just handed random scenes. I remember a few scenes that I animated. They didn't amount to anything, but it was, I think most of us animators were just handed out scenes randomly from here and there, so we never really had a sense of what the story was about. So I didn't have any idea until I saw the finished movie later. And I saw the movie and I went, oh my God, this is terrible. So I never watched it a second time. Well, I'm not real familiar. If you asked me today what the movie was about, I couldn't tell you, except they were 9 short stories, and each one in which Fritz gets killed, hence the title 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat. And that's all I remember.
It's a very, story-wise, it's a very hazy film. I would say that out of every movie I've seen, it's probably the most accurate depiction of the cloudy mind that comes from marijuana smoke.
Oh, yeah.
Something interesting about that, too, is before Robert Taylor was attached as director, I was going through old news articles, and originally a man named George Singer was attached as a director. Did you know anything of this?
No, I haven't heard this before. George Singer was some guy kind of on the fringes of the animation industry. He would occasionally show up and produce some really cheap something and pay the animators below scale. So only people that were really out of work and had to have some kind of income would ever work for him. I never met him.
Of course, I asked you as well, was there a difference in the directing methods between Robert Taylor and Bakshi? Do you think Robert, or did you personally ever get a sense that Robert had as much passion for his directorial effort as like Ralph did?
Maybe. It was hard to tell. Robert Taylor was a guy with a lot of charisma, and he was fun to be around. I really liked him as a friend. Beyond that, I don't know.
Originally, let's see, so we were talking about a little bit about Robert Taylor, and if he had any real, I guess, a real investment in what he was doing with this movie.
I don't know. I think he felt very attached to it. That was the impression I got. But as far as the way he directed the animators, I didn't see much, at least in my case, in the way of any special instructions, because the characters weren't doing much besides walking and talking or else running. Now, in the Warner cartoons, for example, or the Disney cartoons, characters do a lot of acting. But that wasn't as much the case with these Fritz cartoons. And what kept them going was whatever the characters were saying while they were walking around and running. So the animators didn't have very much to add.
Right. that was I love, Ralph's films, of course, but they don't really have like kind of the expressiveness that you would catch in older animated films in terms of it's just very down to earth. It's pretty straightforward storytelling.
Yeah, now there's a couple of things that work here. One of them is the older films had much better budgets. The budgets were small, but compared to what Ralph Bakshi had, not even enough money to shoot pencil tests and cutting various other corners. You just couldn't be very adventurous. So that's one problem. And so that's not even the fault of the director. That's just the circumstances. And then the other thing is that Ralph's pace went more to really down-to-earth movies like Midnight Cowboy and stuff. And he wanted to do cartoon versions of subject matter that was sort of like the underbelly of American life. So, for example, in Heavy Traffic, some of the main characters, one guy doesn't have any legs and he has to paddle around on a board with wheels. And the various characters with difficult circumstances. And he was making quite a statement about the main character, Michael. His character's parents, were, his mother was Jewish and his father was Italian. And Ralph felt that was of interest. And so a lot was being made about that, but mostly through dialogue. And then, of course, Michael has a girlfriend who is black. He also has a friend who raises pigeons on a roof who is black. I forget the names of the characters. Carol, I think, was the name of the girlfriend.
Right.
And so these were things that would generally not show up in a Disney or a Warner cartoon.
Yeah, the friend he had who was on the rooftop was a guy named Crazy Mo, who I believe is played by an actor named Charles Gordon, who would later play the Preacher Fox character in Coonskin.
Oh, okay.
Jumping back to Heavy Traffic, I was reading a lot of old articles on that movie as well, and the reaction to Heavy Traffic was really fascinating because it seemed like for a very hot minute there that Ralph was, at the time there was a thing called the American New Wave, or today it's more known as New Hollywood, and they were putting Ralph in the same company as people, or Vincent Canby, the film critic in particular, was putting Ralph in the same company as people like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Peter Bogdanovich. It was the decade of the director being the creative visionary of films. And I just think that's I just think that's fascinating because putting a cartoon director in the same company as these more prestigious live action film directors is something.
Well, I'm sure that the live action directors have much more money to make their movies with. So to draw too much comparison between Ralph and the other people without taking into account the extreme difference in film budget is probably not fair to Ralph.
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean by that. It was just interesting that people were actually, for a very solid moment here, taking animation, or at least anybody involved with animation, seriously as, a director to watch out for. This guy is going to make some amazing films. Like Ralph said that the reaction to Heavy Traffic has been more, quote, filmatic. It's not It wasn't a reaction of, oh, this is a really neat cartoon. It was a reaction of, oh, this is like a legitimately great film that fits into this movement that's going on right now in cinema.
I think that was probably very big on Ralph's mind, his hopes and his intentions. He wanted to make cartoons, but not in the traditional sense. Yeah.
How close in production were because Heavy Traffic came out in 73, and then The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat came out in 74, and my friend was looking at your film credentials, and he was like, man, these movies came out back to back each year. And I was like, yeah. How close in production were they? Were they being done at the same time or apart?
Well, they were done separately, except that 9 Lives was being done the same time that Ralph was working on Coonskin. But between features made by the same director, well, there was a gap in between. For at least a couple months where they were trying to pull a story together. And then the movie might be in production about 8 months. And then right away it would come out in the theaters.
Right.
So for a movie to come out, a new movie to come out each year, yeah, that would be about right. 8 months in animation and then a little bit of post-production work and then into the theater.
Yeah, looking through the credits on Heavy Traffic and The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, so many people who worked on Heavy Traffic are also credited on 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat. I mean, there's Robert Taylor, of course, is both in Heavy Traffic and 9 Lives, and then there's also Manny Perez and Manny Gould. There's you as well as Marty Terrace, Art Vitillo, Wallace Jones. It's like, it almost seems like everybody was working on things simultaneously. On top of that, a lot of these guys were also doing work for DePatie Freeling, if I'm correct.
Well, the one thing I can say for sure is that they were not working for more than one studio at a time. That I can say for sure. So if it looks like they were, because of the screen credits and stuff, well, it wasn't that way.
Oh, okay. So there was no jumping back and forth, well, I'm done here at this studio, time to run to the other one?
Well, it would be like that, but when they're working for one studio, they're working only for that studio.
Okay.
And then when they're done, well then, the pay in those days was so abysmally low that all of us just existed paycheck to paycheck. The pay was miserable.
Oh, man.
Through the 1970s, the pay for an experienced animator was $150 a week. And you just about couldn't survive on that. Even in the 70s, that was difficult to survive on. At one point, somewhere around the mid to late 1970s, Bill Hanna at Hanna-Barbera Studio called several of the animators into his office. And this was a time when every 3 years, all the contracts have to be renewed by the unions for the next 3 years. And it all comes up at the same time. Live action people and cartoon people. So anyway, this was one of those times when contracts were being voted on. And Bill Hanna called several animators into his office, and he says, I'm asking you to vote to strike against me as producer for more money. Because he says, frankly, I'm embarrassed to pay you guys so little, but the only money I can pay you with is what I get from the networks. And I've begged the networks to give me more money so I can pay you better, But the networks, they're a bunch of assholes, and they say, well, if the animators are willing to do it for free, fuck them, let them. So the only way I can get money for you guys is if you go on strike. And then I can say to the networks, they won't work for free anymore. We have to pay them more money. So you got to give me more money for these shows so that I can pay the animators. That's how bad things were back then.
Wow.
But even the producers asked the animators, please vote to strike against me, because otherwise I can't get any more money to pay you.
My friend was looking at your credits too, and yesterday, and he's like wondering, like, how did Milton Gray jump from The Jungle Book to Fritz the Cat and to Fat Albert? And I told him, well, that's animation. It's like migratory labor.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
He also thought it must have been like kind of a whiplash to go from something as crazy and fascinating as Ralph Bakshi to just basically back to the world of other stuff that was being done in animation on television.
You know, I was depressed about leaving, finishing a feature with Ralph and having to go back to Hanna-Barbera because it was so formulaic and no room to do anything that could be considered good work. And Ralph gave me some advice, which surprised me. He said, Milt, even though you're working on limited animation at Hanna-Barbera, pretend that you are working on something that's decent, because you're drawing the key poses, and make those poses as meaningful and expressive as you can, as if they were going to be used in full animation. And I thought, wow, that's a really positive way to look at it. So I tried to apply that in my work. Because Ralph said, later, when you go back to full animation, well, then you'll have the experience of having continued more creative thinking, and you'll be that much better prepared to do good work.
Did you know there's a guy who's credited with production work on both Heavy Traffic and the second Fritz the Cat movie? And I've seen him credited on DePatie Freeling stuff too, but a guy named Harry Love. You ever met him or heard of him?
Oh, yeah. Oh, boy, do I have Harry Love stories. Love was probably a pretty decent kind of guy, but he was a guy who was not very distinguished as a great talent. Now, whatever political reasons might have been involved, I don't know. But that's kind of the territory that he existed in. So he tried to make a name and a position for himself by selling himself to the producers, whoever he happened to be working for at the time, saying, I will really crack the whip. I will really yell at the animators to do more footage, even though the guys are working about as hard as they can. Still, I can keep costs down for you if I can get the animators to do more footage. And they said, great, okay. So that's how Harry was known in the business. I first ran into Harry when I was working at DePatie Freeling on whatever crappy shows we were working on. The Princess and the something, I can't remember, Princess and the Dragon. Whatever show. So here's Harry Love, and I'm doing a good amount of work and keeping the quality up and keeping my footage up pretty well. And all of us, no matter what we were doing, would routinely get called into Harry Love's office, and he'd give us the speech. More footage. You're going to get fired if you don't increase your footage. Well, the other people, I think, just said, yeah, okay, Harry, okay. Then I went back to the desk and just shrugged it off and forgot about it. Because they didn't care. But me, being new, I thought, oh my gosh, really? And I said, Jesus, I'm doing as best I can. I can't do any more. I'm trying. So Harry and I would get into arguments. The other guys just say, okay, Harry. But Harry and I would get into arguments. And these things would build up over time. Later, when I was working at Bakshi Krantz, and we were working on heavy traffic, and then Ralph got booted out of the studio for a week or so, and this other guy, Gerard Baldwin, was brought in. It was about at that time that Harry Love was getting into trouble of some kind at Patty Free Lane. And so he called Steve Krantz and he says, hey, I'm Harry Love. I got a good reputation for being, crack the whip kind of guy and really make the animators produce more. And so I can save you money by being a pressure guy. So Steve Krantz, who doesn't know anything about anything, says, oh yeah, that sounds good. Okay, come on over. So now here's Harry Love again, and I'm working there. And by now, I've had just enough time go by that I've started to wise up a little bit. I also knew that I was really a fair-haired boy at that studio because Ralph loved me, and he loved the work I was doing. So I knew that if I got into trouble with somebody like Harry Love, Ralph Bakshi would stand up for me. So Harry Love couldn't fire me, because if he did, Ralph would just hire me back. So I started going out of my way to be a total asshole to Harry Love. And once in a while, just for no reason, we had chairs that had rollers on them. And I would roll my chair over to the doorway, stick my head out in the hallway, and just scream, fuck you, Harry Love. And I'd roll back to my desk. Well, Steve Krantz would come running out of his office. What's wrong? What's happening? And I don't say a word. I'm just sitting at my desk. I don't know anything. And the other artists in the same room with me, they're in on the joke. So they don't say anything. And so Steve Krantz goes down to Harry Love. What's going on? And Harry Love doesn't know. And he's trying to explain and he can't. And so I kept this up. Did it several times. And on top of that, we had a couple of checkers working in the studio who would turn in their footage reports every week to Steve Krantz. But Harry Love, as a supervisor, was also supposed to turn in footage reports to Steve Krantz. So, I gave correct information to the checkers, but I deliberately put false information on my report to Harry Love. So Harry Love's reports would never match the reports from the checkers. And Steve Krantz decided saying, Harry, what the hell is this? These reports don't match up. They should be the same. Of course, Harry Love didn't know. He was taking my word for it. And so, me and Harry Love, we were just at each other, nose to nose. Finally, Harry Love got fired because somehow things just didn't seem to be working. Yeah, well, they weren't working because I was creating no end of trouble. And of course, Ralph was there at that time. He had been brought back after a short time after Gerard Baldwin. So of course, Ralph was always standing up for me. And I always felt protected.
That's
now,
incredible.
Harry Love, later, I did interview him for Mike Barrier's book. And he seemed to be a really nice guy when I was interviewing him for Mike Barrier's book. So I'm a little bit inclined to give Harry Love kind of the benefit of the doubt. He's probably an okay guy for the most part. But since he chose to go down the dark path, well, he ran into me. So that's pretty much the Harry Love story.
I actually read a little bit of what Gerard Baldwin had to say about his time on Heavy Traffic. He doesn't really go into much details other than I don't think he had much love for Harry Love or Steve Krantz. Yeah, it was an interesting account. It's very short, but basically it seemed like he admits that he wasn't a good fit for Heavy Traffic for one thing because it's not his story, it's Ralph's.
Yeah. And all of us animators hated Gerard Baldwin simply because we saw him as pushing Ralph out of the picture, and we were loyal to Ralph.
Yeah.
We felt Ralph really had a vision, and we were loyal to Ralph, so we had very negative feelings about, and it wasn't anything that Gerard Baldwin did to us, but he just wasn't Ralph.
Oh, yeah. I was looking through some more credits here, and there's a guy credited on the second Fritz movie, and I think he's credited on Heavy Traffic as well with layout. It's a guy named Alex Ignative or something. And
let's see, I almost remember Alex Ignatieff. I think that's the pronunciation.
Yeah,
Does that kind of fit the lettering?
It's look, maybe it's Russian. It's like Ignatiev.
Yeah, Alex Ignatieff. I think that's the pronunciation. Other than that, I really don't know anything about him.
I think it says, I don't know how accurate IMDb is. It says he did uncredited work on Pinocchio, and Alice in Wonderland. It seems like a lot of his work is uncredited up until a certain point.
That could be. There were a lot of people that worked at Disney's that didn't have enough footage on a single movie to get a credit. They had a rule that you had to have 500 feet of footage done in whatever your category was on a single movie before you got credit. And there was one guy whose feelings were really hurt because he was just 10 feet short of having 500 feet on Lady and the Tramp as an animator, and he did not get a credit. And he was really unhappy about that. He complained about that for years afterwards.
So
I should say decades afterwards.
Wow. Here was something I was thinking about yesterday. I was talking to some, at people who are fans of animation. We were talking online at one point, and one of them mentioned Norman McCabe being born in England, and I was like, what? And I looked it up, and sure enough, Norman McCabe was born in England. And so somebody was like, what did he even sound like accent-wise? Did he sound American, or did he have like some kind of English twang in his voice?
Well, I knew Norm McCabe pretty well, and I never noticed any accent in his voice. Of course, I knew him many years later.
Right.
He was working at Warner's in the 30s, and so he'd been in America for a long time. I never noticed any accent in his voice. He was a really nice guy. I really liked him.
Yeah.
Of course, he directed a lot of cartoons at Warner's.
Yeah, we were talking about that too, because we were doing Norman McCabe. He passed away in 2006, and those golden, the Looney Tunes Golden Collection DVDs, which I think you've done some commentaries on those.
Yeah.
And so it just like kind of smacked us in the head, and we're like, wow, somebody who worked on these cartoons was still alive when these DVDs were being put out. And I was around entering high school age, I think, when a lot of the last Golden Age directors were coming and going, because there was Chuck Jones. It was either Bill or Joe from Hanna and Barbera, also passed away around this time, I think. I think it was Bill Hanna. Which...
Yeah, I don't remember which one went first.
Yeah. Here's a couple of guys. I keep getting these guys mixed up. I'm like looking through old credits. There was a John Walker, and then there was a James T. Walker. So I got their names mixed up.
See, John Walker was kind of middle-aged. James T. Walker. Now, I'm wondering if that is the name of a guy who is younger than me. Tim Walker. James Tim Walker. That's probably who that is. Now, unfortunately, in about the middle of his life, Tim Walker got Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
And it completely messed up the right side of his body. And since he is right-handed, well, that means he can't write or draw. So he had to very quickly train himself to write and draw with his left hand. And he put out a book later. He learned fairly quickly and did really good artwork with his left hand. So he put out a book called Drawing from the Left. And so there he is with Parkinson's disease, which really messes up your mind, as well as cripples up your body. So this guy's had a pretty hard life. He's a real nice guy. I really like him. But he has had a very difficult time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That was one of the things, I think that's what the interview actually was about, was regarding that book you mentioned. And he was talking about Parkinson's disease. And I was looking through his animation credits too as well, and he's a very impressive repertoire and resume as well.
Oh yeah, he was working with us at Bakshi's studio on Coonskin and probably Naked Looking. I think this was before he got Parkinson's, and so he was working there, I think, as an assistant animator on those two pictures.
I think I might be confusing him for John Walker, but I think he's also credited on Heavy Traffic as well, but he's definitely on Coonskin, and I'm pretty sure he's on Hey Good Looking as well.
Now, John Walker was with us on the first Fritz and probably Heavy Traffic. And it would be about that time or shortly afterwards that Tim Walker would have been coming into the business.
Yeah.
Because they would be a generation apart. Now, they're not related.
I figured.
They just have to have the same last name.
Let's see, The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat. I think the only other person I ever heard who worked on that movie commented on it was one of the background artists, a guy named Bob Schaefer, who referred to it as a gory piece of crap in an interview. Me personally, I think The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, I think, well, story-wise, it's a mess, of course, but there's a lot of visual things going on in it that I think are really really cool to watch. And of course, the voice acting is great. The music chosen for the film, fantastic, but definitely could have used some work in the story department. I just think it's cool that, there was a point in the 70s where there was like this Steve Krantz's studio. They were like pumping out 3 years in a row these animated films that were not for children. They were for adults. And that is in America is such a rarity. That's almost a Guinness Book of World Record there. So I think they're cool movies. I think it's a cool, it's definitely, I was a kid when I saw the 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat. I had to have been like in the 11 or 12 range. And a little young. That was also around the same time, that, I first came across Heavy Traffic. And, my thought as a kid was, oh, hey, what's this? A cartoon for adults? Huh, interesting. I should watch it. And then, Heavy Traffic being the movie it is, I'm just kind of sitting there looking at it and thinking, oh my God, what is this? I don't think I'm ready for this. And so I just kind of avoided it. And then I watched it again, in high school. And that was when it clicked with me. I was like, oh, wow, I get this now. Incredible. So yeah, that was an interesting period there, coming across these 2 movies. That was when I first became familiar with Ralph Bakshi's name, actually, was because of Heavy Traffic was airing on cable TV at one point, believe it or not.
Oh, he died.
Yeah, and the second Fritz the Cat movie also got aired on cable television, but for some reason the first one always kind of seemed to be evasive.
The first one really was X-rated.
Oh, yeah. Well, Heavy Traffic has a bit of an odd history because that was X-rated too.
Yeah.
And then at some point it got edited and submitted again and got an R rating, but
right.
I'm not sure what happened. For some reason it still has the R rating, but a lot of people confirmed that it's in fact the original X-rated cut. But I guess nobody did their homework to check and see so it still has an R rating, but it's the original X-rated cut of the film that's available out there.
Well, the differences are very tiny between the X-rated version and the R-rated version. Ralph reanimated a couple of scenes to eliminate what got the X rating, and so the 2 pictures look so much alike that unless you really know what you're looking for, you completely miss the difference.
What about the transition? What do you remember about the transition from the Steve, it looks like after the second Fritz the Cat movie, Steve Krantz pretty much closed the door on working in animation after that.
That's right, yeah. He didn't produce anymore after that.
Do you remember, back on the subject of Robert Taylor, do you know if he ever really expressed his feelings on the film, his overall feelings on the movie?
I cannot remember any comments that he made, to me anyway. He may have had strong feelings, but they were not made to me, so I don't really know. I haven't heard of anything. I think that Robert Taylor probably just shrugged the thing off. The film did not get a very wide release. It was not very well received. And so he just moved on to other things and kind of forgot about it. That's my best guess.
Oh, okay.
Because I know that Robert Taylor worked on a bunch of other things. I mean, I was in touch with him over the years, but he just never mentioned it again. He got talked into, at Hanna-Barbera, he got talked into directing a movie called Rock Odyssey. which was supposed to be a rock fantasia.
Yeah.
And that movie was kind of a disaster, just like Nine Lives of Fritz. Whose fault that was, I don't know, because I wasn't involved.
Right.
So I don't know what got changed during production or anything. And then there was another cartoon movie at Hanna-Barbera. I think it was called Heidi's Song.
Yeah, that was his second film after Fritz.
Was Heidi's Song before Rock Odyssey? Because he worked on both of them.
Yeah, it was, Heidi's Song was what, it seemed like Hanna-Barbera. I was reading an old article that John Canemaker wrote about Heidi's Song, and it seemed like Hanna-Barbera was pretty excited about that project, and especially seemed like they had a lot of confidence in Taylor as a director too. And as far as it's funny you brought up Rock Odyssey. That was their attempt at gaining an older audience, and it's I've actually seen Rock Odyssey. Or did you ever see it yourself?
I'm trying to remember if I did. I'm thinking I probably did. But if I did, I can't remember anything from it.
It's much like the Nine Lives of Fritz the Cat. It's a bit of a mess. It's a bit of a mess, but it has a lot of visual things going on in it that are really, in my opinion, incredible. There's the story is very disjointed and everything, but some of the visual things in it are just like, wow, that is something I'm never going to see anywhere else. So I have a fondness for Rock Odyssey, because for the longest time it was easy to find artwork and stuff from Rock Odyssey, but finding the actual film itself was pretty much near impossible. Jerry Beck wrote that he had seen it at a festival in the late 80s, and that was it. And the only reason there's a copy of Rock Odyssey that's around was because by chance somebody recorded it off of it aired, I forgot where it aired on television. It aired on television either somewhere in Asia, somewhere in Spain, or South America. One of those three places. And just by pure chance, somebody recorded it, and that's how it's available in that condition for people to see. And that's how I managed to see it, was I saw that copy that was recorded off of television. So, yeah.
Well, maybe I never saw it. Maybe it was just never released, and so I never saw it and then finally forgot about it.
So moving on to, you worked on Coonskin, of course, as it says let's see. Oh, Coonskin has some Irvin Spence is on Coonskin, of course. Like, he's on every Bakshi film, I think. You remember much about Irvin Spence?
He was a top animator at MGM on Tom and Jerry cartoons. And he's a real nice guy. I met him at Bakshi's.
He's one of the guys, along with John Sperry, I think he's one of the guys that Ralph always talked about the most fondly when reminiscing. Well,
Irv Spence had a huge reputation, having worked on all those Tom and Jerry cartoons.
There's also Charlie Downs, who worked at Hanna-Barbera at some point as well. He worked on Heidi's Song with Robert Taylor as well. And there's another guy, this was the guy I was thinking of, a guy named Ambrosi Paliwoda.
Oh, yeah, let me think for a minute. I know the name. I'm trying to remember how it goes. Emily Paliwoda.
Yeah, I was looking through his credits, and he was years back, and I guess apparently he's worked on Snow White. Are you familiar with anything he had done?
No, I don't know what he did on Snow White, but he was the guy who was just 10 feet short of getting his credit as an animator on Lady and the Tramp.
Oh.
And he was still complaining about that when I knew him at Bakshi's.
Yeah, this is the one film he's credited on. Do you remember much about the transition from the Steve Krantz studio into Bakshi's new animation studio?
Well, no, I helped move furniture that Ralph had purchased from somewhere, animation desk, into his building. But other than that, once the desk was set up, well, then when it was time to call animators, we were just called in and said, okay, you sit here, you sit here, you sit here. And we just started working. So there really wasn't much to tell.
Oh, yeah. Of course, Coonskin is, it's definitely, that one was hard to come by for quite a while. It got released on DVD eventually, but I had to buy a bootleg tape of it, which oddly enough, I bought it from Ralph and he signed it.
Oh, I'll be darned.
Yeah, so I have a tape signed by the man himself, which it's one of my favorite, at least one of my prized things. Yeah, and of course, the controversy over the film is something that's been written about. It was actually obvious. It was like a big studio movie that Paramount was supposed to distribute it, and then they dropped it over the controversy.
Yeah.
And it got,
I'd say the controversy is a really strange thing because Ralph grew up in a black neighborhood and he knew a lot of black people and he had positive feelings towards them.
Yeah.
And his whole point of making Coonskin was to comment on the mistreatment of black people and the kind of stereotyping and stuff that they face. And it was meant to be a very positive statement on behalf of black people and the problems that they face. But while the movie was in production, word got around that there was this movie being made about black characters called Coonskin. And wow, white liberal extremists just went apeshit and black, what's the word? I can't think of the word. What's people that are
extremists, maybe?
Yeah, extremists, but activists, political activists. I can't think of a word, but anyway, those two groups of people just went crazy. And so the movie got a huge reputation before it was even finished. And so Ralph couldn't release it. So I guess he lost money on that because...
pretty much your experience working on Coonskin, there was really no like feeling that anything was going to blow up. It just felt like another day at the office, or?
It was in between. It was another day at the office. We knew what the movie was about. Ralph hired, from time to time, a few black people, writers and artists, to come and look at what we were doing and give their opinions. And when they saw what we were doing, they were quite positive about it. And they said, no, I'm not offended at all. I'm glad this is being made. So when it came time to release the movie, and everybody just wouldn't touch it, well, Ralph was sat there, and by that point it was too late, no matter what Ralph said. Well, the public had already heard all this other stuff, that the movie was the complete opposite of what it actually was, that the movie actually mocked black people made by white bigots that were attacking black people. And boy, that reputation stuck.
Yeah, it's so here's a personal. This is a story I think is kind of funny, but it's for me personally. When I was in high school, when I first got a hold of the bootleg tape that Ralph signed for me, and I don't know what I was going through my mind. I loaned it to for reasons I don't comprehend now, I loaned the tape to this girl I was going to school with, and she was a really cute girl, and she she watched it with some of her other girlfriends, and they were shocked and horrified a little bit by it. And what was funny to me was one of them referred to it as gross. And it was not because of like any racial content. It was because of the busty, topless blonde girl in the beginning of the film.
Oh, yeah.
And so I always...
The sheriff's daughter.
Yes, the sheriff's daughter. And of course, there's also Miss America, who's very similar character design to the sheriff's daughter, actually.
Yeah.
And so, their reaction towards the film had more to do with, I guess, just that busty depiction of women versus the actual racial content of the movie. I eventually regained my good reputation back with them, so it didn't turn out all bad. But yeah, no, I was reading the history on Coonskin, and the reaction towards it always seemed, it seems like it always seemed more positive than negative. I mean, there was old articles where they interviewed black audience members who had seen the movie, and, one of them, of course, commented, he thinks that it was an honest portrayal of what is up with America and its attitudes towards black people. There was an author who wrote a whole book on blaxploitation named Darius James, and he had nothing but high praise for Coonskin, and he thinks it's one of the greatest films of that era made. And I think Coonskin, like the home video rights, I think are owned by a black-owned business too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you mentioned the producer of Fritz the Cat, who picked it up after Warner Brothers, was a guy, I forget his name. I want to say it's Jerry Gross, but he owned the company called Cinemation, who distributed a film called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. And I think the company that distributes Coonskin on DVD, I think is the company that is owned by the director of that film.
Oh.
So yeah, it's an interesting, its distribution history is pretty interesting. Once Paramount dropped the movie, it got picked up by a company called Bryanston. And of course, Bryanston's, their most popular films was a horror movie called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and another film that was their most popular film was a porno called Deep Throat. And the funny thing is that I was doing research on this company, and the man who started the company was a mafia man. And there was a whole series of articles about him and his connections into distributing movies and things like that. I didn't have time to like completely access the articles yet, but it was interesting to read that. And of course, Ralph, his comments about that was he thought it was funny in a very ironic way that his attitude towards the mafia, and here's the mafia distributing his anti-mafia movie.
Right, yeah.
There was a lot of live action in Coonskin. That was the thing that always really surprised me about it, was a lot of animated characters against a lot of live action.
Yeah, Ralph loved to do that. That was his way of trying to be a filmmaker, a legit filmmaker.
Right. You worked a little bit on Hey Good Lookin', right?
Yeah.
What?
I only worked a little bit on both of those pictures, so I didn't get a screen credit on either of them, because I didn't have enough footage to qualify for a screen credit.
Yeah. I was looking through Hey Good Lookin's credits, and did you ever see, like, the movie pretty much went on hiatus because of the Coonskin controversy, I guess?
Well, I know that Ralph made Hey Good Looking 3 different ways, and he would cut animation out of one version and add different animation into the next version. And there were 3 different versions of that movie. And I think it was the second version that was being shown in one theater only in Santa Monica. And so I drove out there just so I could see if my scenes were still in there. And a few of my scenes have survived.
Yeah.
But he had so many people telling him, we don't like it, change it. And so there are 3 different versions of the same movie. And I guess it's the 3rd version that's the version that's available in home video.
I didn't know there was I knew there was like a first version it was all like Coonskin, it was all live action, but with cartoon characters put into these live action worlds.
That might be. See, I wasn't there when that was going on. I was still working on 9 Lives of Fred's.
There was it was a few years ago that somebody uploaded online a reel from Warner Brothers. The Warner Brothers studio would put out a reel of their coming attractions, previews for oncoming movies, and it actually has a trailer for Hey Good Lookin' that has scenes from the original cut, and Ralph narrates it, and it has live action shots, and this was the first time anybody, I think the general public, had even seen these, and so that was like a real exciting thing, like, wow. Yeah.
I'm not sure, it's been so long since I bought my DVD copy. I don't remember where I got it from. Maybe it was from the Warner. I almost think it was. I have this faint memory of Warner's releasing Hey Good Lookin', so I grabbed it. So that might be the one that I have.
I'll send you a link to it later on if I can find it. It's the original scenes from the original cut that didn't make it into the final film. I think you and I might have the same cut of Hey Good Lookin'. But yeah, that one is always interesting to me just because it started production in the mid-70s, right after Coonskin, and didn't get a release theatrically until some point in 1982, I think. So your time on Hey Good Lookin' pretty much was very short. Wasn't much. It was
pretty short, and maybe it was a month or 2. Something like that.
So did you do any work on? You're also credited on Heavy Metal. Did you do any work on that?
Heavy Metal was done in Canada. Oh, and come to think of it, I think John Bruno was kind of in charge of it, or at least along with another guy named Gerard somebody. And they were having trouble getting the thing animated because up in Canada, like New York, there were not enough animators. So I was between jobs, and John Bruno said, would I animate on this thing? And so by mail, he mailed me scenes to work on. I did them at home and sent them back. I didn't work on very much. I did some scenes in a section called Tarna.
Right.
This half-naked lady was kind of a sword fighter or something. And that was... I did some scenes with that. And then something came up. I'm trying to remember what it was. And so I bailed out on working by mail. Oh, that was a funny story, by the way. Yeah, starting to come back to me. John Bruno called me and said, would I work on this? And I didn't want to, because I was really tired. I just finished a difficult job. And I was just a few weeks away from starting another job, whatever it was. It might come back to me. So I really didn't want to do this, but I didn't want to say no to John Bruno. So what I did was I said, well, okay, but I'll have to charge a high price. And I charged a price that was so ridiculously high that I thought for sure the studio would say, no, we can't pay that. And then I'd be off the hook. But to my astonishment, the studio said, well, okay, if you recommend them, okay. And I think I was charging at that time, this was unheard of at that time, $800 a week.
Wow.
Which was like 3 times what anybody was being paid in those days. And to my astonishment, they said, okay. So for a few weeks, I got paid $800 a week.
That's incredible.
And then I went on to something that I had already promised I would go work on for much less money. It was only a few weeks that I worked on Tarnak.
Did you ever watch Heavy Metal when it came out, or no?
I saw it one time when it came out. And it was the same thing as 9 Lives of Fritz. I thought, oh, God. And I never looked at it again.
Oh, man. My opinion of that film is a bit different from yours. I loved it. Did you? Oh, yeah. I mean, as a kid who, I wanted to be a cartoonist, and I grew up reading comics and watching cartoons, of course. I was the right age when I saw Heavy Metal. I was 13 years old, just hitting adolescence. And so seeing an animated film with scantily clad women who are, beautifully drawn, great artwork, and really incredible music. And it really is a movie that appeals to the adolescent brain. And if you're a teenage boy who aspired to be a cartoonist, it's something that you kind of cherish.
Well, I'm glad somebody liked it.
Oh, yeah. It's got quite a cult following, especially for the soundtrack. I think I've taken up quite a bit of your time. What would your closing statement be if looking back on those years you spent at the Bakshi Krantz studios, how would you summarize your feelings about them?
I would say this. I had such a miserable time working in this awful industry that, oddly enough, those years I worked with Ralph Bakshi were probably the best years in the industry for me.
Wow.
Now, working at Disney's was nice. I got good training and stuff. But I was not happy about what I was working on. I thought Jungle Book was terrible. And having the Beatles sing Barbershop Quartet, I was going, oh my God, what are they thinking? And then the Aristocats was even worse. And so, my memories of working at Disney's are fine. Nothing great, but working for Ralph Bakshi, I think I would have to say that of my whole career, that was the highlight. That was the part I loved the best. I still love Ralph, I really do.